Chapter 14. The Watcher Again. Once Gavin had built his decoy hut, he returned to his aunt and uncle's house for lunch. Uncle Fergus sat across from him. Occasionally he gave Gavin a friendly smile. "What are your plans for this afternoon and tomorrow, Gavin?" he asked. "Oh, I'll just mooch around," said Gavin casually, although his heart was thumping with the thought of the clan hunt. "As you know, Aunt Elspeth will be in Stirling with her friends," said Uncle Fergus. "But Betty will give you your meals, and I will tear myself away from my work to say hello to you now and again." Gavin smiled at Uncle Fergus, who grinned back. "Just hammer on the library door if you want anything, or if you feel like a chat," said Uncle Fergus. "Otherwise, just come and go as you please. I'll see you safely in bed at night, though." "OK," said Gavin. "You needn't worry. I'll be fine on my own. I've one or two things to do today and tomorrow anyway." Uncle Fergus, who had guessed he was up to some game with Claire and the others, nodded. "I know you'll be sensible and not do anything silly. Now I'll get back to work. I'll be glad when it's finished. Having such a lot of silver in the house makes me nervous, even though it's well looked after," said Uncle Fergus as he stood up. "Enjoy yourself, Gavin, and don't forget, if you want anything, bang on the door. Bang hard, mind, because once I get involved in my writing, I don't hear anything." Grinning at his aunt and uncle, Gavin left the table and hurried to his room. He wanted to think over his campaign plans. He'd spent that morning building his decoy hut in the woods, and now he wanted to get ready for his afternoon and night in the hidden castle. He made up his mind he would take his gear to the castle that afternoon and dump it there. He would return to the house, say goodnight to Uncle Fergus, and go to his room. Once it was dark, he would slip out of the house and go back to the castle and stay there until the morning. He began to get his gear together. Gavin was blissfully happy. He had scored off the clan. They had been so busy watching his decoy hut that he had had no difficulty in throwing them off his tracks. Feeling elated, he had hurried through the woods to the hidden castle. There he had laid out his ground sheet and sleeping bag, eaten a few sandwiches and fallen asleep watching the stars through the dark, waving branches of the trees. He'd woken up once or twice in the night, but on the whole he had slept quite well. He awoke in the early hours of the morning. The sun shone through the trees. All around, birds were in full song. There was a fresh smell of earth and leaves wet with dew. Gavin stretched, then got out of his sleeping bag. He had slept with most of his clothes on. Walking to the little stream that trickled down the rocks, he splashed his face and hands with water and dried himself on his handkerchief. Now for breakfast. He pulled out Mott's notes and samples and examined them closely. Kindling wood was needed. That meant soft woods like birch, ash or fir. Then harder wood to keep the blaze going, oak, or indeed anything once there was a blaze. He examined the trees. The birch was easy. Slim, silver trunk, feathery light green leaves. There were several nearby. Gavin examined the branches, breaking off all the dead wood he could see. The yew trees at the castle entrance also had plenty of dead wood on lower branches, and soon he had a fine pile. He took it back to his fireplace and dropped it on the ground. Then he raked around until he found larger, chunkier pieces and piled them up as well. Gavin hummed happily to himself. He was enjoying this feeling of being alone, of being in the woods and yet being able to look after himself. With Mott's notes to help him, he had not found it too difficult finding suitable wood. He examined the cliff fireplace. At its foot was a small recess at the bottom of the rock. It was open for about a metre, then it disappeared inside the rock just like a real chimney. Gavin consulted his notes again. Now he remembered. He searched around until he found a firm piece of wood shaped like a catapult in the form of a Y. With his knife, he sharpened it to a point and then pushed it into the earth. Then he broke off the smallest twigs, little thicker than a matchstick, and piled them up against the Y stick so that they resembled a little wigwam with a gap at one side. He sat back on his heels and looked at it. What next? He moved some of the stones in the fireplace closer to the wood. They were large and flat-topped and would hold his Dixie firmly over the flames. Then he took out 2 matches. Only 2 were permitted, the clan had said. He struck one. It spluttered and went out before he could apply it to the small sticks and dead leaves. He struck another. The kindling curled and blackened. A thin wisp of smoke went up. Gavin watched anxiously. Then more flames appeared, and in a minute his pile of kindling was burning steadily. Carefully, Gavin laid on larger sticks, and when they were alight, he piled on some large, chunky logs. They would burn more slowly and would provide a steady flame. They would also do as a base for his dixie. There was very little smoke, proving that the wood was dry and dead. Mott had told him that wet wood or green wood gave off lots of smoke, so Gavin had been very careful to look for wood in dry spots. He filled his dixie with water and put it on the fire, balancing it carefully on the stones. Soon the water sent up hordes of tiny bubbles. Then the whole surface gurgled and boiled. Gavin dropped in 3 handfuls of porridge oats, making sure he stirred steadily all the time to avoid any lumps. He sprinkled in a little salt, and after a few minutes the porridge was ready, hot and thick. Gavin lifted the dixie off the fire with the bulldog grip, the metal claws grasping the edge tightly. He sprinkled on a little sugar, added some milk from a carton he had put in his rucksack, and ate steadily. He looked at his watch. 5 a.m, it said. He had plenty of time before hurrying back to the house for lunch. He'd left a note saying he was skipping breakfast as he was out for a walk. Uncle Fergus did not know he'd been out of the house all night, so he would have to slip in quietly. Then he had to evade the clan all day until midnight that night. The rules of the hunt were that he had to cook 1 meal. So far he was halfway through that without any mishap. After eating his porridge, Gavin ate the rest of his soggy sandwiches, and he reflected on his plans. He decided to hang around the castle until late morning, then to return later and lie up there until dark. He decided to have some tea. He scraped all the porridge dregs out of the dixie and put them into a small hole he had dug in the leafy soil near the entrance to the castle. Then he covered them over. The clan never left litter. Besides, litter might be a clue to where he had been. He filled the dixie with water again. When the water boiled, it removed the remainder of the porridge, which swirled around in the water. Gavin emptied it out. The dixie was clean again, but he gave it a wipe with some grass just to make sure. Then he refilled it and piled more wood on the fire. Soon the flames were roaring up the chimney again. Gavin put the dixie back on the heat. He took the small tea infuser from his rucksack and hooked it onto the side of the dixie. Soon the water boiled and turned brown. Gavin lifted it off the fire again and poured it into his cup. He added sugar and milk and drank slowly. It was good, hot and sweet. He leaned against the rock, enjoying the feeling of well-being, the sun on his face and the silence of the woods all around him. The birds had stopped their morning chorus as the sun had risen higher in the sky and were on the hunt for food. Robins, chaffinches and thrushes perched on the trees around the castle, hoping for some scraps. Remembering the story of the babes in the wood and how their bread trail was eaten up, Gavin threw some crumbs to the side and sat still. Soon the small woodland birds were pecking busily. After a time, Gavin decided to go home. He packed up his gear, poured his tea dregs on the fire until the last ember had been quenched, and then scattered the black dampened sticks amongst the trees. He covered the black fireplace with dead leaves and earth, and soon the castle looked as if no one had visited it for years. Gavin climbed to the top of the tower and looked all around. The woods seemed silent. Carefully, he picked his way down to the bottom of the crags. Then, walking quietly, he moved through the trees in the direction of the house. Soon he saw its red roof and his bedroom turret. But just before he stepped out of the bushes onto the path, he saw something that made him stand very still. Lying on the ground near the top of a small rise was a man.